The Mediterranean sun blazed mercilessly against the white stone terrace of the Monaco resort, each ray seeming to amplify the headache pulsing behind my eyes. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to focus on the financial reports scattered across the glass table before me, but the numbers blurred together like watercolors in rain. 3 days of back-to-back negotiation meetings had left me exhausted, my usual composure fraying at the edges. I reached for my water glass, the condensation cool against my palm, and took a long sip, hoping the hydration would clear my head. The ice clinked softly, a delicate sound almost lost beneath the distant murmur of waves against the shore and the low hum of conversation from other resort guests scattered across the terraces below. This annual business conference in Monaco was supposed to be straightforward: consolidate alliances, finalize shipping routes, maintain the territorial agreements that kept the East Coast running smoothly under our family's influence. Instead, I'd spent 72 hours navigating inflated egos and thinly veiled power plays, all while maintaining the facade of legitimate business dealings. My phone buzzed against the table, Enzo's name illuminating the screen with a curt message. Meeting with the Calabrese family moved to 4 p.m. Dress code formal. Don't be late. I suppressed a sigh. Enzo Moretti, at 34, was the most meticulous, demanding, and, if I was being honest, intimidating boss I'd ever worked for. As his personal secretary for the past 2 years, I'd learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, to read his moods in the subtle tightening of his jaw, or the dangerous softness that crept into his voice when someone tested his patience. Working for a man who controlled half the East Coast's underground operations required a particular kind of discretion, a willingness to see without truly seeing, to know without acknowledging what I knew. The heat was becoming unbearable. I could feel sweat beading at my hairline, trickling down the back of my neck beneath the severe bun I'd twisted my dark hair into that morning. My cream linen blouse clung uncomfortably to my shoulders, and I longed for the air-conditioned sanctuary of my hotel room. But Enzo had asked me to review these quarterly reports before the Calabrese meeting, and I'd learned quickly that his requests were actually commands wrapped in courteous language. I was so absorbed in deciphering a particularly convoluted shipping manifest that I didn't notice Marco's approach until his shadow fell across my papers, mercifully blocking the sun's assault. "Miss Russo," his deep voice rumbled with concern. "You're going to burn." I looked up to find Enzo's head of security standing beside my chair, his broad frame creating a welcome patch of shade. Marco was built like a fortress, 6'3" of solid muscle, his dark suit somehow immaculate despite the heat. In the 2 years I'd worked alongside him, I'd learned that beneath his intimidating exterior lay a surprisingly gentle nature, especially toward those he considered under his protection. "I'm fine, Marco," I assured him, though my shoulders were already beginning to feel tight with the warning signs of sunburn. "Just trying to finish these before the meeting." He frowned, producing a bottle of high SPF sunscreen from seemingly nowhere. "With respect, Miss Russo, you're already turning pink. The boss would have my head if you got sun poisoning on my watch." The mention of Enzo's potential displeasure made me pause. It was true that my boss had exacting standards about everything, including the well-being of his staff. Last month, when I'd come to work with a cold, he'd sent me home with a private doctor and enough medication to stock a pharmacy, all while lecturing me about the importance of maintaining one's health for optimal performance. The concern had been characteristically impersonal, focused entirely on efficiency rather than genuine care, but the gesture had touched me more than I cared to admit. "I suppose a little sunscreen wouldn't hurt," I conceded, reaching for the bottle. "Turn around," Marco instructed. "Your shoulders and back of your neck are the worst. You'll never reach it yourself." There was nothing inappropriate in his tone. Marco treated me with the same protective professionalism he extended to all of Enzo's trusted inner circle. Still, I hesitated for a moment before complying, setting down my pen and shifting in my chair to present my back to him. The sunscreen was blessedly cool against my heated skin, as Marco worked it across my shoulders with surprising gentleness, for hands that I'd seen break a man's arm without apparent effort. His touch was entirely clinical, efficient, as he spread the lotion across the exposed skin at the nape of my neck, where my bun left me vulnerable to the sun's assault. "There," he said after a moment, his voice carrying satisfaction. "That should protect you for the next few hours at least. You really should wear a hat though, Miss Russo. This Mediterranean sun is no joke." I turned back to face him, offering a grateful smile. "Thank you, Marco. I'll remember that tomorrow. Is this work?" The voice cut through the air like a blade, cold, sharp, and absolutely lethal in its quiet intensity. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid as recognition sent ice flooding through my veins despite the heat. Enzo stood in the terrace doorway, backlit by the interior shadows of the resort, his tall frame rigid with something I couldn't quite identify. At 34, he commanded attention without effort. Dark hair impeccably styled, his custom-tailored charcoal suit fitting his athletic build perfectly despite the heat, steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. But it was the set of his jaw, the dangerous stillness in his posture, that made my breath catch. Marco straightened immediately, his hand falling away from my shoulder as though burned. "Boss, I asked," Enzo interrupted, his gaze fixed on me rather than his security chief. "If this is work, Elena." There was something in his tone, something beneath the surface ice, that I'd never heard before. In 2 years of working closely with him, I'd learned to read the subtle variations in his voice, the particular timbre that preceded violence against those who crossed him, the slight warming when he was genuinely pleased with something, the absolute frost that indicated someone had made a catastrophic error in judgment. But this was different. This carried an edge I couldn't quite identify, something almost personal. Something possessed me in that moment. Perhaps it was the heat, or the exhaustion from 3 days of endless meetings, or the way the sun had made me lightheaded. Perhaps it was the romance novel I'd hidden in my desk drawer back in New York, its pages dog-eared from rereading my favorite scenes of fictional heroines who dared to challenge powerful men. Perhaps it was simply that working so closely with Enzo for 2 years had worn down some of my natural caution, made me forget the very real danger that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. Whatever the reason, I found myself meeting his gaze directly, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth despite the warning bells clanging in my head. "I didn't know the boss cared so much about my skin," I said softly, the words escaping before I could call them back. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground would hold or crumble beneath my feet. Marco went absolutely still beside me, and I could practically feel his shock radiating outward. No one spoke to Enzo Moretti that way. No one challenged him, teased him, showed anything but complete deference or carefully calculated respect. For a moment, Enzo's expression remained unreadable. Those steel-gray eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. Then something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something else I couldn't name. The muscle in his jaw tightened, and I watched his hands clench briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. "Marco," he said, still holding my gaze, "you're dismissed." "Boss?" Marco began, but Enzo cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "Now." The security chief departed without another word, though I caught the worried glance he shot in my direction before disappearing into the resort. And then I was alone with Enzo. The Mediterranean sun beating down mercilessly, my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized the magnitude of what I'd just done. He moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood beside my chair. Up close, I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, unusual for him, a sign of the grueling schedule he'd been maintaining. The scent of his cologne reached me, expensive and subtle, mixing with the salt air and sunscreen. "Stand up, Elena." It wasn't a request. I rose on unsteady legs, having to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. At 5'4", I'd always felt small around him, but never more so than now, with less than a foot of space separating us. "In 2 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made my skin prickle. "You have never once spoken to me with anything less than perfect professionalism. So I'm going to ask you again, and I suggest you consider your answer very carefully. Was that comment work?" I should have apologized. Should have lowered my gaze, stepped back, returned to the safety of our carefully maintained professional distance. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, I found myself holding his stare, my chin lifting slightly in what I immediately recognized as a mistake. "Would the boss prefer I lie?" I heard myself ask, the words barely above a whisper. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "What I prefer," he said, each word carefully measured, "is understanding why my secretary, my efficient, professional, always appropriate secretary, suddenly has the audacity to mock me." "I wasn't mocking," I began, but he raised a hand, silencing me. "You were," he corrected, though there was no heat in his voice now, just that same unreadable intensity. "The question is why? Have I been unclear about expectations? Has someone given you reason to think such behavior is acceptable?" "No, sir, I faltered, unable to explain even to myself what had possessed me. "I apologize. It won't happen again." For a long moment, he simply looked at me, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being studied, analyzed, catalogued in ways I didn't fully understand. Then, without warning, he reached past me to gather the scattered reports from the table, his arm brushing my shoulder in the process. "These are adequate," he said, his tone returning to its usual professional coolness, as though the past few minutes hadn't happened. "But there's an error in the third quarter projections for the shipping routes through Miami. Fix it before the Calabrese meeting." "Yes, sir." My voice came out steadier than I expected. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "And Elena? In the future, if you require sun protection, ask my assistant to provide it. Marco has other responsibilities." Then he was gone, leaving me alone on the sun-drenched terrace, my heart still racing, my hands trembling slightly as I sank back into my chair. I pressed my fingers to my flushed cheeks, trying to understand what had just happened, why I dared to speak to him that way, why the encounter had left me feeling simultaneously terrified and strangely alive. It was only later, as I was reviewing the corrected reports in my hotel room, that I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I'd been avoiding for longer than I cared to admit. The way my pulse jumped when Enzo entered a room, the warmth that spread through my chest when he praised my work, the dreams I refused to examine too closely, where professional boundaries blurred into something infinitely more dangerous. I was falling for my boss. For a man who controlled a criminal empire with an iron fist, who inspired fear in hardened criminals, who saw me as nothing more than a useful employee. For a man I could never, should never, allow myself to want. I pulled the latest romance novel from my suitcase, a guilty pleasure I'd never admit to anyone, and tried to lose myself in the fictional world of passionate declarations and happily ever afters. But even the story's powerful hero seemed pale compared to the reality of Enzo Moretti, and the heroine's romantic dreams felt uncomfortably close to my own hopeless fantasies. Outside my window, the sun was setting over Monaco, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new meetings, new challenges, the return to professional distance and carefully maintained boundaries. But tonight, alone in my room, I allowed myself to touch my shoulder where Marco's hands had been, where Enzo's gaze had lingered with that unreadable intensity. And I wondered just for a moment what it would feel like if those hands had been his instead. The Calabrese meeting had gone exactly as Enzo predicted. Tense negotiations over shipping routes that ended with handshakes and veiled threats disguised as business courtesies. I'd taken notes throughout, maintaining my usual professional demeanor, though I could feel his eyes on me more than once during the 3-hour ordeal. Each time I glanced up, he was looking elsewhere, but the weight of his attention lingered like a physical touch. 2 months had passed since Monaco, and I'd convinced myself that the terrace incident was an aberration, a heat-induced moment of madness we'd both chosen to forget. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as life could be when you worked for a man who controlled half the East Coast's underground operations. The New York autumn had arrived with its characteristic bite, transforming the city into a canvas of amber and crimson. I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped out of Enzo's Midtown headquarters, the October wind cutting through the wool with ease. It was nearly 8 in the evening, the streets still bustling with the energy that never quite left Manhattan, even as darkness fell. "Miss Russo, your car." I turned to find Marco gesturing toward the black sedan idling at the curb, its engine purring softly in the twilight. Since Monaco, I'd noticed a subtle shift in how Enzo's security detail treated me. More attentive, more protective, as though I'd been reclassified from mere employee to something requiring closer observation. "Actually, I think I'll walk tonight," I said, adjusting my briefcase strap on my shoulder. "It's only 10 blocks to my apartment, and the fresh air might help clear my head." Marco's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "The boss prefers you use the car service, Miss Russo, especially after dark." It wasn't the first time this conversation had occurred. In fact, it had become an almost nightly ritual, me asserting my independence, Marco gently but firmly redirecting me toward Enzo's preferences. Usually I acquiesced without much protest, too tired to argue. But tonight, after hours of watching Enzo negotiate territorial agreements with the cold precision of a chess master, I needed the space to breathe, to remember that I existed outside the gravitational pull of his world. "Please tell Mr. Moretti I appreciate his concern, but I'm perfectly capable of— Tell me yourself." The voice came from behind me, and I spun to find Enzo emerging from the building's entrance, his suit jacket unbuttoned, the knot of his tie loosened slightly. Small concessions to comfort that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. In 2 years, I'd rarely seen him less than perfectly composed, and the sight of him in this slightly disheveled state sent an unwelcome flutter through my stomach. "I was just explaining to Marco that I'd prefer to walk home tonight," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "It's not far, and the weather is— It's 42 degrees and dropping," Enzo interrupted, moving to stand beside his security chief. "You're carrying confidential documents in that briefcase, and you're exhausted after a 12-hour workday. Marco, ensure Miss Russo gets home safely." The dismissal was clear, but something in me, perhaps the same reckless impulse that had possessed me in Monaco, refused to yield. "With respect, sir, I'm not actually required to use the car service. My contract specifies—" "Your contract." His eyes locked onto mine with that intensity I'd come to recognize as a warning sign. "You're going to cite your employment contract to me, Elena?" The way he said my name, with that slight emphasis that made it sound like both a caress and a reprimand, sent heat flooding to my cheeks. I was acutely aware of Marco standing nearby, of the driver waiting patiently by the car, of the pedestrians flowing past us on the sidewalk. We were having this confrontation in public, which was so unlike Enzo that it immediately put me on edge. "I'm simply pointing out that I have the right to— Get in the car." 3 words, spoken quietly enough that anyone passing might have missed them, but carrying such absolute authority that I felt my knees weaken slightly. This was Enzo in command mode, the voice he used when giving orders he expected to be obeyed without question. I'd heard him use it with business associates, with rivals, with members of his own organization, but never, in 2 years, directed at me. I should have complied. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to simply nod, slip into the sedan, and let Marco drive me home. Instead, I heard myself say, "What if I don't?" The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Marco shifted uncomfortably, and I saw the driver's eyes widen slightly in the rearview mirror. Enzo's expression remained perfectly controlled, but I watched his hands clench briefly at his sides before relaxing with visible effort. "Then I will personally ensure you arrive home safely," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "Marco, bring the car around to Miss Russo's building. We'll meet you there." Before I could process what was happening, Enzo had taken my briefcase from my shoulder with one hand and gripped my elbow with the other, steering me firmly down the sidewalk. His touch was impersonal, professional, but I could feel the warmth of his palm through my coat sleeve, could sense the barely leashed tension in the way his fingers pressed just slightly too firmly against my arm. "You're being ridiculous," I managed to say, trying to ignore how my pulse jumped at his proximity. "I don't need an escort for a 10-block walk." "Clearly you do," he replied, his long strides forcing me to quicken my pace to keep up. "Since you seem incapable of making sensible decisions about your own safety." We walked in charged silence for half a block before I found my voice again. "I've been walking these streets for 3 years without incident. I'm perfectly capable of—" "You're perfectly capable of many things, Elena." He didn't look at me as he spoke, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw tight. "But understanding the reality of your position isn't one of them." The words stung more than they should have. "My position? You mean as your secretary?" "I mean," he said, his voice dropping lower, "as someone who works closely with me, as someone who has access to sensitive information, as someone whose safety is therefore a legitimate concern." There was something in his tone that made me look up at him more closely. In the glow of the streetlights, I could see the tension etched in the lines of his face, the way his free hand had formed a fist in his coat pocket. He was genuinely worried, I realized with a start. Not annoyed at my defiance, not asserting dominance for its own sake, but actually concerned about something happening to me during a simple walk home. The realization softened something in my chest, made my voice gentler when I spoke again. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you." He glanced down at me then, surprise flickering across his features before his expression shuddered again. "I'm not worried. I'm ensuring operational security." But the slight flush along his cheekbones, barely visible in the dim light, suggested otherwise. We'd made it 6 blocks in silence when a voice called out from behind us. "Excuse me, miss. I think you dropped this." I turned to find a young man in his 20s, jogging toward us, holding what looked like a scarf. He was handsome in a boyish way, with an easy smile and kind eyes, dressed in the casual style of a graduate student or young professional. Completely harmless. "Oh, that's not—" I began, but the man had already reached us, holding out the scarf with a sheepish grin. "My mistake. Could have sworn I saw it fall from your bag." His gaze lingered on me a moment longer than strictly necessary, his smile widening. "Though I'm not entirely sorry for the error. Would you happen to know if there's a good coffee shop around here? I'm new to the neighborhood." It was harmless flirting, the kind I encountered occasionally and always politely deflected. I opened my mouth to offer directions to the nearest Starbucks when I felt Enzo move. It was subtle. A shift in his posture, a slight angling of his body to place himself more directly between me and the stranger. His hand, which had released my elbow when we stopped, now settled at the small of my back, possessive and unmistakable in its message. "The lady is occupied," Enzo said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made the young man's smile falter. "I suggest you find your coffee elsewhere." The stranger's eyes widened as he finally seemed to register who he was talking to. Whether he recognized Enzo specifically or simply sensed the danger radiating from him, I couldn't tell, but he took a hasty step backward. "Right. Sorry. My mistake." He disappeared into the crowd with admirable speed. I turned to look at Enzo, whose hand still rested against my back, warm even through my coat. That was unnecessary. He was just being friendly. He was being interested. Enzo's jaw tightened. There's a difference. And if he was, I'm perfectly capable of declining a conversation without your intervention. Clearly. His tone was dry, and when his eyes met mine, I saw something flickering in their depths that made my breath catch. Hence why you were smiling at him. I was being polite, I protested, though my cheeks heated at the accusation. It's called basic courtesy, not flirtation. Then you should recalibrate your understanding of how your courtesy is perceived. He resumed walking, his hand dropping from my back in a way that felt like both relief and loss. Men see what they want to see, Elena. Your friendliness can be easily misinterpreted as invitation. The presumption in his words ignited something in me. So I should be cold and dismissive to every stranger who speaks to me? Should I scowl at doormen and waiters too? Or is this special advice reserved for situations where I might accidentally smile at someone without your permission? He stopped walking so abruptly that I took 2 more steps before realizing he was no longer beside me. When I turned back, he was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something raw and unguarded that disappeared almost instantly behind his usual mask of control. Without my permission, he repeated, his voice soft and dangerous. Is that what you think this is about? I don't know what this is about, I admitted, frustration bleeding into my words. You've never cared about my personal interactions before. In 2 years, you've never once commented on how I speak to vendors or clients or anyone else. So forgive me for finding your sudden concern rather suspicious. The streetlight above us flickered, casting his face in alternating shadow and light. When he spoke again, his voice had gentled, but the intensity remained. I've always cared about your safety, Elena. The difference is that recently, I've become more aware of the threats to it. Something in his tone made my heart skip. What threats? Has something happened? Is there a specific... You happened. The words seemed pulled from him against his will. You happened, and I realized how vulnerable you are, walking around this city like you're invisible when you're anything but. I stared at him, trying to parse the meaning behind his words, my mind cataloging every inflection, every micro-expression. This was the most personal conversation we'd ever had, straying far from the carefully maintained boundaries of employer and employee. And the way he was looking at me, like I was a problem he couldn't solve, an equation that refused to balance, sent warmth flooding through my chest despite the October chill. I'm not invisible, I said softly. But I'm also not important enough to warrant this level of protection. I'm your secretary, not what? He took a step closer, and suddenly the busy Manhattan street felt like it contained only the 2 of us. Not someone worth protecting? Not someone whose absence would matter? The question hung between us, loaded with implications I didn't dare examine too closely. My mouth had gone dry, and I struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of what I felt, what I'd been carefully hiding for months. We should keep walking, I finally managed. Marco will be waiting. Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or relief, before he nodded and resumed our journey. We completed the final blocks to my building in silence, but it was a different quality of quiet now, charged with things unspoken. The black sedan was indeed waiting when we arrived, Marco standing beside it with his usual impassive expression, though I caught a flicker of curiosity in his eyes as he took in our silent approach. Thank you for walking me home, I said formally, reaching for my briefcase, though I still maintain it was unnecessary. Enzo handed over the briefcase, but didn't immediately release it when my fingers closed around the handle, forcing me to meet his gaze. Humor me, he said quietly. Use the car service. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. The personal plea, so unlike his usual commands, undid me completely. All right, I conceded. I'll use the car service. Satisfaction briefly softened his features before the professional mask snapped back into place. Good. I'll see you tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock sharp. We have the Cordova meeting. I nodded and turned toward my building's entrance, acutely aware of his gaze following me until I disappeared through the doors. It was only when I was safely in the elevator, alone with my racing thoughts, that I allowed myself to really process what had happened. Enzo Moretti had walked me home, had physically intervened when another man showed interest, had looked at me like I was something precious, something worth protecting, even if he couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge why. In my apartment, I dropped my briefcase by the door and moved to the window, looking down at the street below. The sedan was pulling away, taking Enzo back to whatever business occupied his evenings. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, my reflection ghostly in the darkness. This was dangerous. Not the physical danger of working for a crime boss, but something far more threatening to my carefully maintained equilibrium. I was falling deeper into feelings I couldn't afford, for a man who saw me as a responsibility rather than a possibility. I pulled my current romance novel from my nightstand. A story about a bodyguard and the woman he protected, their professional relationship evolving into passion. The parallels to my own situation were almost painful. But unlike the heroine in my book, I couldn't indulge in fantasies of reciprocation. Enzo's protection was about operational security, about maintaining control over his organization. Nothing more. I was repeating this truth to myself as I drifted off to sleep, trying to ignore the warmth that still lingered where his hand had rested against my back, the way his eyes had darkened when he'd said, "You happened." Trying to ignore the dangerous hope blooming in my chest, despite every rational reason to crush it before it could fully flower. 4 months after the walk home, winter had seized New York with icy determination. I stood in Enzo's private office on the 42nd floor, watching snow drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows as he conducted a phone conversation in rapid Italian. His back was to me, one hand thrust in his pocket, the other holding his phone with barely controlled tension evident in the rigid line of his shoulders. The past months had been a masterclass in restraint. After the incident with the young man on the street, Enzo had become increasingly present, not overtly, never in ways I could directly challenge, but in 1,000 small gestures that accumulated into an unmistakable pattern. The car service was now mandatory, with Marco or another security detail ensuring I arrived safely each morning and evening. The lunch meetings I once attended alone now always included Enzo's presence, his sharp gaze tracking every interaction I had with vendors, clients, or business associates. Just last week, he'd dismissed a waiter at an upscale restaurant for what he deemed excessive familiarity when the young man had complimented my dress while taking our order. I should have been angry, should have protested this gradual encroachment on my independence. Instead, I found myself hyper-aware of him in ways that made concentration increasingly difficult. The way his jaw tightened when another man entered my orbit, the possessive hand at my back when we walked into meetings together, the intensity in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking, and beneath it all, the growing certainty that I was deluding myself with romantic fantasies, projecting meaning onto actions that probably stemmed from nothing more than Enzo's pathological need for control. The phone conversation ended with a sharp word that needed no translation. Enzo set the device down with careful precision, the kind of deliberate movement that indicated barely leashed frustration. "Problem?" I asked, setting aside the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing. He turned to face me, and I caught the flash of something dark in his expression before it smoothed into professional neutrality. "The Santoro family has decided to test boundaries. Nothing that concerns you." The dismissal stung more than it should have. In 2 years of working closely with him, Enzo had never fully opened up about the darker aspects of his business, maintaining a careful barrier between his professional life and the criminal empire beneath it. I understood the reasoning: plausible deniability, protection through ignorance. But it still felt like rejection, a reminder that I would never truly be part of his world. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Is there anything you need me to handle before the holiday party tonight?" The annual Moretti Foundation Holiday Gala was Enzo's primary foray into legitimate philanthropy, a black tie affair that attracted politicians, business leaders, and old New York money. As his secretary, I'd been planning the event for months, ensuring every detail met his exacting standards. Everything should be in order. He moved to his desk, extracting a long, flat box from the top drawer. "However, there's been a change in plans. You'll be attending as my guest rather than in an administrative capacity." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Foundation's board has expressed concern about the optics of my arriving alone for the 3rd consecutive year." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though this were a routine business decision rather than something that made my heart race. "I require a date for the evening, and you're the logical choice. You're already familiar with all the guests and the event agenda." The logical choice. Of course. Not because he wanted to spend the evening with me, but because I was convenient, already briefed, an efficient solution to a social problem. "I see." I struggled to keep disappointment from my voice. "I'm not sure I have anything appropriate to wear to an event of that caliber. Which is why I took the liberty of having something prepared." He gestured to the box. "It should fit. My assistant confirmed your size from your employment records." Heat flooded my cheeks at the thought of him reviewing such personal details, of caring enough about my appearance at his side to arrange appropriate attire. I approached the desk slowly, lifting the lid to reveal a gown in midnight blue silk, its elegant lines and subtle beading speaking to both restraint and luxury. It was breathtaking. "This is too much," I protested, even as my fingers itched to touch the fabric. "I can't accept." "It's a work requirement, not a gift." His tone brooked no argument. "You represent the Moretti organization tonight. I expect you to look the part." The dismissal of any personal element should have been reassuring, should have reinforced the professional nature of this arrangement. Instead, it felt like another door closing, another reminder that whatever I imagined I saw in his actions, I was reading romance into practicality. "When should I be ready?" I asked, closing the box carefully. "The car will collect you at 6. We need to arrive early to greet the major donors." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly. "Elena, thank you for agreeing to this." The use of my first name, the hint of genuine gratitude, sent warmth cascading through my chest despite my better judgment. "Of course, it's part of my job." Something flickered in his eyes. Was it disappointment? Before his expression cleared. "Indeed. You're dismissed for the afternoon. Take time to prepare." I gathered my belongings, acutely aware of his gaze following me to the door. As I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. "Elena?" I turned back to find him watching me with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Yes?" "The dress. Blue suits you." It was such a small comment, so seemingly innocuous, yet delivered with an undertone that made my skin flush with awareness. Before I could formulate a response, he'd already turned back to his desk, effectively dismissing me. The subway ride home passed in a daze, my mind replaying his words, searching for hidden meaning in tone and inflection the way I'd become expert at doing. This was dangerous territory, reading intention into professional courtesy, letting hope override reason. In my apartment, I opened the box again, running my fingers over the silk. The dress was perfect, chosen with an understanding of my style that suggested more attention than I'd realized Enzo paid to such details. I tried it on, and it fit like it had been made specifically for me, the midnight blue, bringing out the olive undertones in my skin. The cut flattering in ways that made me feel beautiful, rather than simply appropriate. I thought about the romance novel currently on my nightstand, a story about a woman who'd served as companion to a wealthy recluse, their professional arrangement slowly transforming into something deeper. It was fantasy, I reminded myself firmly. Real life didn't work that way. Real life was pragmatic men who chose dates for efficiency and bought dresses to maintain corporate image. But as I stood before my mirror, watching the silk catch the light, I allowed myself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if tonight was real. If Enzo had asked me as a woman he wanted to spend time with, rather than a convenient employee. If the possessiveness I'd noticed over the past month stemmed from desire rather than control, dangerous fantasies for a woman who should know better. The car arrived precisely at 6, Marco emerging to hold the door with his usual professional courtesy, though I caught the slight widening of his eyes when he saw me in the gown. The drive to the Plaza Hotel where the gala was being held seemed both too long and too short, my nerves ratcheting higher with each passing block. Enzo was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, and the sight of him in formal evening wear momentarily robbed me of coherent thought. I'd seen him in expensive suits daily for 2 years, but there was something about the classic lines of a tuxedo that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, the lean strength evident even through civilized clothing. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his steel-gray eyes tracking my approach with an intensity that made my steps falter. Elena. My name on his lips sounded different tonight, weighted with something I couldn't identify. You look. He trailed off, and I watched a muscle tick in his jaw as his gaze traveled over me with slow deliberation. The dress was an excellent choice. Thank you for providing it, I managed, hyper-aware of how his eyes lingered on the way the silk draped across my shoulders. Should we go in? Instead of answering, he produced a small velvet box from his pocket. One final detail. He opened it to reveal a delicate diamond pendant on a platinum chain, simple and elegant. Before I could protest, he'd moved behind me, his fingers brushing the nape of my neck as he fastened the clasp. The touch lasted seconds, but it sent shivers cascading down my spine, my breath catching audibly. There. His voice was close to my ear, low enough that it felt intimate despite the public setting. Now you're perfect. Perfect. The word echoed in my mind as he offered his arm, as I placed my hand in the crook of his elbow, as we entered the ballroom together. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of introductions and small talk, Enzo's hand a constant presence at my back or elbow, guiding me through the crowd with possessive ease. I watched him work the room with the skill of someone who understood power and how to wield it. Charming when necessary, intimidating when required, always in control. But whenever someone's attention lingered on me too long, a business associate's appreciative glance, a donor's friendly conversation, I felt Enzo's grip tighten subtly, saw his jaw clench in that telltale way. It was during dinner, seated beside him at the head table, that everything began to unravel. I must say, Enzo, your choice of companion this evening is refreshing. The speaker was Lorenzo Russo, a rival family head whose relationship with Enzo was cordial but tense. He smiled at me across the table with practiced charm. Much lovelier than the usual society girls who frequent these events. Miss Russo is my secretary, Enzo replied, his tone carefully neutral, even as his hand found my knee under the table, a touch clearly meant as claiming rather than comfort. She's intimately familiar with the Foundation's work. I'm sure she's intimately familiar with many aspects of your operations. Lorenzo's smile widened, the innuendo unmistakable. Lucky man. The implication hung in the air, and I felt Enzo go absolutely still beside me, his hand tightening on my knee with barely restrained force. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace I'd heard him use with those who'd made catastrophic errors in judgment. I'd choose your next words very carefully, Lorenzo. The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Lorenzo's smile faltered as he seemed to register his mistake, his gaze darting between Enzo and me with dawning realization. My apologies, he said quickly. I meant no disrespect to Miss Russo, simply admiring Enzo's excellent taste in all things. The moment passed, conversation resuming around us, but Enzo's hand remained on my knee, his touch burning through the silk of my dress. I risked a glance at his profile, finding his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed straight ahead with barely controlled fury. Are you all right? I whispered, low enough that only he could hear. He turned to look at me then, and the intensity in his gaze stole my breath. Did he make you uncomfortable? The question surprised me. Not the words themselves, but the genuine concern beneath them. The barely leashed protectiveness that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. I'm fine, I assured him softly. It's not the first time someone's made assumptions about working relationships. It should be the last. His voice was low, dangerous, and his hand finally lifted from my knee, only to find my hand on the table, his fingers threading through mine in a gesture that was entirely too intimate for the public setting. You deserve better than crude innuendo from men who should know better. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at our joined hands, his thumb absently stroking across my knuckles in a way that couldn't possibly be unconscious. Enzo, dance with me. It wasn't a question. He was already rising, drawing me with him toward the dance floor where other couples swayed to the string quartet. My mind screamed warnings. This was crossing lines, blurring boundaries, inviting complications neither of us could afford. But my traitorous body followed his lead as he guided me to the center of the floor. His hand settled at my waist, warm even through silk, while his other hand cradled mine against his chest. We began to move, and I was struck by how naturally we fit together, how his taller frame seemed designed to shelter mine, how right it felt to be held this way. I need to tell you something, he said after a moment, his voice rough. About why I brought you tonight. My pulse jumped. You said it was for the board, for appearances. I lied. The admission hung between us, weighted with implications that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Or rather, I told myself that was the reason. But the truth is, I wanted you here. Not as my secretary. Not as a convenient solution to a social problem. As my date. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I don't understand. Neither do I. A humorless laugh escaped him. For 6 months I've been trying to rationalize this, telling myself my concern was professional, that the way other men look at you only bothers me because you're part of my organization, that wanting you close was about security rather than... He trailed off, his grip on my waist tightening. I've run a criminal empire since I was 23, Elena. I've negotiated with the most dangerous men in 5 countries. And somehow, you've become the thing I can't control, can't categorize, can't seem to function rationally around. My breath caught, hope and fear warring in my chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that when I saw Marco touching you in Monaco, I wanted to break every bone in his hand, even knowing he meant nothing by it. I'm saying that every man who looks at you makes me want to eliminate competition in ways that would horrify you. I'm saying that I've been lying to myself for months, and I'm done pretending that this, he gestured between us, is purely professional. The confession was so unexpected, so raw, that for a moment I could only stare at him. Then reality crashed back, bringing with it all the reasons this was impossible. You're my boss, I whispered, though my body betrayed me by moving closer to his. This is. We can't. Can't what? His hand moved from my waist to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Can't acknowledge what's been building between us? Can't admit that you feel it too? Even if I did. I forced myself to meet his gaze, to be honest even as it terrified me. You're Enzo Moretti. You could have anyone. Why would you want your secretary, someone ordinary who... You think you're ordinary. His laugh was genuine this time, though tinged with disbelief. Elena, you've challenged me in ways no one else dares. You see through my control, call me on my bullshit with that sweet smile that makes me forget why I should maintain distance. You're brilliant, kind, brave enough to walk alone at night despite my objections, stubborn enough to argue with a man most people fear. Nothing about you is ordinary. The sincerity in his words undid every defense I'd carefully constructed. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. He pulled me closer, until mere inches separated us, until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my temple. Just tell me I'm not alone in this. Tell me you feel even a fraction of what I feel, and we'll figure out the rest. I should have lied, should have protected us both from the complications this would inevitably bring. But as I looked up into his eyes, seeing vulnerability I'd never expected from him, the truth spilled out before I could stop it. You're not alone, I whispered. You've never been alone in this. Something fierce and triumphant flashed in his expression. The hand cradling my face slid to the back of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair in a way that made me shiver. He was going to kiss me, here, in front of half of New York's elite, with no regard for discretion or consequences. And God help me, I wanted him to. But before his lips could meet mine, his phone vibrated insistently in his pocket. He froze, a muscle ticking in his jaw as he clearly debated ignoring it. Then, with visible reluctance, he released me, stepping back to check the message. Whatever he read drained the warmth from his expression, replacing it with cold fury. I have to go. There's been an incident that requires my immediate attention. The abrupt shift from intimate confession to professional crisis left me reeling. What kind of incident? The kind that reminds me why involvement with me is dangerous. His voice had gone flat, carefully controlled. Marco will take you home. We'll discuss this later. Enzo. Not now, Elena. He was already moving away, signaling to Marco across the ballroom. Just go home. Be safe. And then he was gone, leaving me standing alone on the dance floor in a midnight blue dress and borrowed diamonds, my heart still racing from confession and near kiss, my mind struggling to process the whiplash of the past 10 minutes. Marco appeared at my elbow, his expression professionally blank. Miss Russo, the car is waiting. I followed him out of the ballroom in a daze, Enzo's words echoing in my mind. You're not alone in this. But as the car carried me through the snowy streets toward my apartment, I couldn't shake the fear that whatever incident had called him away was exactly the kind of dangerous reality that would ultimately make anything between us impossible. In my apartment, I carefully removed the diamond necklace, placing it in its velvet box with trembling fingers. The dress went onto a hanger, but I couldn't bring myself to look at my reflection. Couldn't reconcile the woman who'd danced with Enzo with the cautious secretary who'd spent 2 years hiding her feelings. Sleep eluded me that night. Instead, I lay awake, remembering the way he'd looked at me, the raw honesty in his confession, the promise of that almost kiss. And beneath it all, the growing certainty that whatever came next would change everything, for better or worse. The romance novels on my nightstand suddenly seemed less like escapist fantasy and more like prophecy. Sometimes the powerful man and the ordinary woman did find their way to each other. Sometimes professional boundaries blurred into something deeper. Sometimes the impossible became possible. But those were stories. And Enzo Moretti lived in a world where fairy tale endings collided with brutal reality, where confessions whispered on a dance floor might not survive the harsh light of day. All I could do was wait and see which truth would win. The call came at 3 a.m, 2 days after the gala. I jerked awake to my phone's insistent buzzing, my heart already racing before I'd even registered the name on the screen. Enzo. Hello? My voice came out rough with sleep and confusion. In 2 years, he'd never called me in the middle of the night. Pack a bag. Enough for 3 days. Marco will be at your building in 15 minutes. His tone was clipped, professional, but I could hear something beneath it. Tension, urgency, carefully controlled concern. I sat up, instantly alert. What's happened? Are you all right? I'm fine. You're not safe at your apartment anymore. I'll explain when you arrive. Arrive where? Enzo, you're not making sense. Elena. My name was a command, pulling me into focus. There's no time for questions. Pack what you need. Trust me. The line went dead before I could respond. Trust me. 2 words that should have sent me running, that should have triggered every self-preservation instinct I possessed. Instead, I found myself moving on autopilot, throwing clothes and toiletries into a bag, my hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening. The Santoro situation. Whatever incident had pulled Enzo away from the gala. This had to be connected, had to be the dangerous reality he'd warned me about. And somehow, it now threatened me directly. Marco was indeed waiting when I descended to the street, his usually stoic expression tight with something that might have been worry. He took my bag without a word, ushering me into the familiar black sedan with an urgency that made my stomach clench. Marco, what's going on? Where are we going? The boss will explain. He pulled into traffic with practiced ease, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror as though expecting pursuit. You're safe now, Miss Russo. That's what matters. Safe. The word felt hollow as we drove through the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Manhattan behind for highways I didn't recognize. I tried to orient myself, but exhaustion and fear made concentration difficult. All I knew was that we were heading north, away from the city, into territory I'd never navigated. 40 minutes later, we turned onto a private road marked only by a subtle gate that opened automatically at our approach. The estate that emerged from the darkness took my breath away, a sprawling property that managed to project both elegance and security, every line designed with purpose. The main house was dark stone and glass, illuminated by subtle landscape lighting that emphasized its architecture without revealing too much detail. Marco pulled up to the entrance, and my door opened before I could reach for the handle. Enzo stood there, dressed in dark slacks and a partially unbuttoned dress shirt, his hair slightly disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. The relief that crossed his face when he saw me was quickly masked, but I'd seen it. Genuine, unguarded emotion that made my chest tighten. You're all right. It wasn't a question, but his hands moved to my arms anyway, as though needing physical confirmation. You scared me half to death with that phone call, I said, allowing him to help me from the car, even as anger and fear warred in my chest. What's going on? Why am I here? Inside first. His hand found the small of my back, that now familiar possessive touch guiding me toward the entrance. Then I'll explain everything. The interior of the house matched its exterior, expensive but not ostentatious, designed for comfort and security in equal measure. Enzo led me to a study paneled in dark wood, gesturing me toward a leather sofa, while he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. I don't drink whiskey, I protested, but he pressed a glass into my hands anyway. Tonight you do. Trust me. You'll want it. I took a small sip, the burn of expensive scotch clearing some of the fog from my mind. Enzo settled into the chair across from me, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult. The Santoro family has decided to escalate their challenge to my territory, he began without preamble. 2 nights ago, they made a move against one of my operations. It failed, but in the process, They obtained information about my associations, including you. My fingers tightened on the glass. What kind of information? Enough to identify you as someone close to me. Someone whose absence or harm would be personally affecting rather than merely a business inconvenience. His jaw clenched. They've made it clear that you're now a potential target, a pressure point they might choose to exploit. The words should have terrified me, and part of me was terrified. But another part, the part that had been falling for this dangerous man for months, focused on something else entirely. Someone close to you, I repeated softly. Is that what I am? His eyes darkened. After the gala, after what I told you, did you think I was speaking hypothetically? I thought you might reconsider in the cold light of day. Realize that involving yourself with your secretary was a complication you didn't need. Elena. He set his own glass aside, leaning forward until only inches separated us. The Santoros identified you as a vulnerability, precisely because I haven't been as careful about hiding my interest as I should have been. The way I look at you, position myself near you, respond to other men's attention. It's apparently been obvious to anyone paying attention. Heat flooded my cheeks. I didn't realize. Neither did I. Not until Lorenzo made that comment at the gala, and I nearly put him through a wall for implying you were anything less than deserving of absolute respect. He reached out, his hand finding mine where it rested on the sofa, his thumb tracing patterns across my knuckles. I've spent my entire adult life maintaining control, keeping everyone at a calculated distance. And then you walked into that interview 2 years ago, so serious in your bargain suit, determined to prove you belonged in a world that clearly intimidated you. And somehow, without meaning to, you got under every defense I'd constructed. My breath caught at the raw honesty in his confession. What happens now? Now you stay here, under my protection, until the Santoro situation is resolved. His grip on my hand tightened. This estate has security that rivals military installations. No one gets in or out without my knowledge. You'll be safe. For how long? As long as it takes. He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. And potentially longer, if you're willing. The implication hung between us, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. You're asking me to move in with you. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe. The rest. He lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles that sent shivers cascading down my spine. The rest we'll figure out together. I should have said no. Should have insisted on alternative arrangements, maintained professional boundaries, protected myself from the inevitable complications. Instead, I found myself nodding, my voice barely above a whisper, okay. Relief transformed his features, making him look younger, less burdened. I'll have your things moved from your apartment tomorrow. In the meantime, there are guest rooms. I don't want a guest room. The words escaped before I could call them back, bold and reckless. Not if this is real. Not if what you said at the gala was true. Something fierce and possessive flashed in his eyes. Elena, you should understand what you're agreeing to. I'm not a man who does casual involvement. If we cross this line, then we cross it. I set my whiskey glass aside, suddenly certain despite all the rational reasons to hesitate. I'm tired of pretending, Enzo. Tired of hiding how I feel, of watching you from a distance, of going home alone every night when all I want is to be close to you. He was moving before I'd finished speaking, pulling me into his arms with a desperation that stole my breath. His mouth found mine in a kiss that was nothing like the gentle, almost kiss from the gala. This was hungry, demanding. 2 years of restraint shattering in an instant. I responded with equal fervor, my fingers threading through his hair as he deepened the kiss, his hands spanning my waist, then sliding up my back to press me closer. He tasted like whiskey and want, like promises and danger. and I couldn't get enough. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "Are you sure?" His voice was rough, strained. "Once we do this, there's no going back to how things were." "I don't want to go back." I cupped his face in my hands, making him meet my gaze. "I want to move forward, with you." What followed was a blur of sensation, Enzo lifting me effortlessly, carrying me through the house to the master suite, lowering me onto silk sheets with a reverence that made my heart ache. He undressed me slowly, as though savoring each revealed inch of skin, his touch alternating between gentle and possessive in ways that left me trembling. When he finally made me his completely, it was everything the romance novels had promised, and nothing like them at the same time. Raw and real, tender and consuming, a claiming that went far deeper than physical. Afterward, as I lay in his arms, my head on his chest listening to his heartbeat slowly return to normal, reality began to intrude on the haze of satisfaction. "What happens in the morning?" I asked quietly. "Do I go back to being your secretary? Do we pretend this didn't happen?" His arms tightened around me. "In the morning, you become something far more important than my secretary." He pressed a kiss to my hair. "You become mine. Publicly, unmistakably mine. No more hiding, no more pretending. The organization will adjust. They'll have to." His voice carried the absolute authority I'd come to associate with his commands. "Anyone who has a problem with it will learn to keep their objections to themselves." I should have been worried about the complications this would create. Instead, I felt only relief. The weight of months of secret longing finally lifted. "I need to tell you something," I said, tracing patterns on his chest with my fingertips. "About why I accepted this so easily, why I'm not more frightened by everything you've told me tonight. Tell me." "I've been half in love with you since Monaco, maybe longer." The confession spilled out, easier now that we'd crossed so many other lines. "Every time you got possessive, every time you positioned yourself between me and other men, every small gesture of protection, I knew I should be annoyed, should assert my independence. But instead, I'd go home and replay it in my mind, adding it to the collection of moments that made me hope you might feel something too." His hand found my chin, tilting my face up to meet his gaze. "Half in love?" "All the way in love," I corrected, my cheeks heating. I just didn't want to admit it fully, even to myself. "Good." His smile was fierce, possessive. "Because I'm not letting you go, Elena. Not now, not ever. Whatever comes next, the Santoros, the organization, all of it, we face together. It should have felt like too much, too fast. But somehow, lying in his arms in this fortress of a home, I felt safer than I'd ever been. Protected not just by security systems and guards, but by the fierce determination in his voice when he spoke of keeping me close. The danger was real. The Santoros. The complications of loving a man like Enzo. The fundamental impossibility of our situation. But so was this. The way he held me like I was precious. The vulnerability he showed that I suspected few others ever witnessed. In the morning, there would be logistics to manage, security protocols to establish, a new reality to navigate. But for now, in the pre-dawn darkness of Enzo Moretti's bedroom, I allowed myself to simply be. To be wanted, protected, loved by a man who controlled an empire, but had somehow lost control when it came to me. "Sleep," he murmured against my hair. "Tomorrow starts our new normal." And I did, safe in his arms, my last conscious thought a silent prayer that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, we'd be strong enough to face them together. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows I didn't recognize, momentarily disorienting me before memory flooded back. Enzo's confession, the threat from the Santoros, the night we'd spent crossing every line that had separated us for 2 years. I turned to find him already awake, propped on one elbow, watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. His dark hair was tousled, his jaw shadowed with morning stubble, and the way his gaze traveled over my face held a possessiveness that was unmistakable. "Good morning," I managed, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I felt in the daylight, without the cover of darkness or the urgency of the moment to shield me from the magnitude of what we'd done. "Good morning." His hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing across my lower lip with devastating gentleness. "Any regrets?" "No." The answer came without hesitation, surprising us both with its certainty. "You?" "Only that I wasted 2 years maintaining distance when I could have had this." He leaned in to kiss me, soft and lingering, before pulling back with visible reluctance. "But we need to talk about practicalities. Your position, the organization, how we move forward." Reality crashed back, bringing with it all the complications I'd ignored in the heat of the moment. "I can't be your secretary anymore. Not if we're—" "No, you can't." He sat up, the sheets pooling at his waist in a way that made concentration difficult. "Which is why I'm promoting you. The Moretti Foundation needs a new director. Someone who understands my vision, who can manage both the legitimate operations and navigate the complexities of our actual business model." I blinked, trying to process the offer. "You want me to run the foundation?" "You've been essentially running it for the past year anyway, managing the gala, coordinating with board members, overseeing grant distributions." His expression was serious, professional, despite our state of undress. "The only difference is that now it will be official, with appropriate compensation and authority to match the responsibility. People will talk. They'll assume I got the position because of this." I gestured between us. "Let them assume what they want." His voice hardened, taking on the edge I recognized from business negotiations. "You're more than qualified. Anyone who questions your credentials will answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his tone sent warmth flooding through my chest. "And the Santoro situation? How long do I need to stay here?" Something flickered in his expression. Hesitation, calculation, the weighing of truths. "The Santoros have been dealt with." "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," he said carefully, "that as of last night, they're no longer in a position to threaten anyone under my protection. The details aren't something you need to concern yourself with." Translation. Whatever he'd done had been violent enough that he wanted to shield me from it. Part of me appreciated the consideration. Part of me recognized that this was the reality of loving a man like Enzo. There would always be shadows I couldn't fully see into, actions taken to protect me that I might prefer not to know about. So I could go back to my apartment if I wanted to. His jaw tightened. "You could, but I'd prefer you didn't." "Why?" "Because having you here, under my roof, where I can ensure your safety personally, it's the only way I can focus on anything else." His hand found mine, threading our fingers together. "Because waking up with you in my arms is something I'm not willing to give up now that I've experienced it. Because this," he gestured around the master suite, "feels right in a way nothing else in my life has for a very long time." The raw honesty in his confession undid every reservation I'd been holding on to. "I don't want to go back to my apartment either," I admitted softly. "But Enzo, we've known each other professionally for 2 years. We've been, whatever we are now, for less than 24 hours. Moving in together seems inevitable," he finished. "Elena, I've negotiated with some of the most dangerous people in 5 countries. I've built an empire through careful calculation and strategic planning. And in all of that, I've learned to recognize when something is worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. You are worth it. How was I supposed to resist that? How was any woman supposed to hear those words from a man like Enzo Moretti and not surrender completely? "Okay," I whispered. "I'll stay." Satisfaction and something deeper, relief, perhaps, or triumph, transformed his features. He pulled me into his arms, and what followed made us both forget about practicalities and complications for a blissful interval. It was only later, as we finally emerged from the master suite, that the true scope of what I'd agreed to began to reveal itself. The house was enormous, far larger than I'd realized in the pre-dawn darkness. Staff moved through the halls with practiced efficiency. A housekeeper, a chef, security personnel whose presence was constant but discreet. "How many people work here?" I asked as Enzo guided me toward the kitchen, his hand at the small of my back in that possessive gesture I'd come to associate with him. "Enough to maintain the property and security." He poured coffee into a mug, doctoring it with cream and sugar in precisely the way I preferred. Another sign of how closely he'd been paying attention for far longer than I'd realized. "You'll meet everyone formally, but the key person is Maria, the head of household staff. She's been with my family since I was a child. You can trust her with anything." The implication that there were others I might not be able to trust sent a small shiver through me. This was his world, I realized fully for the first time. Not just the luxurious trappings, but the constant need for security, the careful vetting of everyone who entered his orbit. As if summoned by thought, a woman in her 60s appeared in the kitchen doorway. Steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant bun, sharp eyes that assessed me with obvious curiosity despite her professional demeanor. "Maria," Enzo said, his tone warming slightly. "This is Elena Russo. She'll be living here permanently. Please ensure the master suite is fully stocked with anything she might need, and begin preparations to move her belongings from her apartment in Manhattan." Maria's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of surprise before her expression smoothed. "Of course, sir. Welcome to the household, Miss Russo. If you'll provide me with your apartment information and a list of any specific items you'd like prioritized, I'll coordinate the move." "Thank you, Maria." I managed to sound more composed than I felt. "I appreciate your help with this." She inclined her head respectfully before departing, leaving me alone with Enzo once more. "She thinks I'm your mistress," I said flatly once Maria was out of earshot. "They all do." "They think you're important to me," Enzo corrected. "The specifics of our relationship are no one's business but ours." He set down his coffee, moving to stand directly in front of me. "Does it bother you? What they might think?" "It bothers me that you have a household staff to begin with," I admitted. "That this is normal for you, living in a fortress, having people anticipate your every need, existing in this world of luxury and danger. I'm a secretary from Queens who shops at Target and takes the subway. This is overwhelming," he supplied, his hands coming to rest on my shoulders. "I understand. But Elena, you're not just a secretary from Queens. You never were. You've been handling confidential information for a criminal organization for 2 years without flinching. You've navigated social situations with politicians and business leaders with grace. You reorganized the foundation's entire grant structure and increased its efficiency by 40%. You're far more capable of thriving in this world than you give yourself credit for." The confidence in his voice, the absolute certainty that I belonged here, made something warm bloom in my chest. "You really believe that?" "I know that." His thumbs stroked along my collarbones, the touch grounding. "And I'll be here to help you adjust, to answer questions, to support you however you need. You're not alone in this, Elena. Not anymore." The following week passed in a blur of adjustment. True to his word, Enzo had my belongings moved from my apartment, though moved was an understatement for what actually occurred. A team of professionals packed everything with meticulous care, cataloged each item, and transported it to the estate where it was unpacked and organized in closets and drawers that were absurdly spacious compared to my former cramped quarters. The foundation directorship became official at a board meeting I attended with Enzo, enduring the speculative glances of members who clearly understood exactly why I'd been elevated. But Enzo's absolute authority over the organization meant no one dared voice objections, and my thorough presentation on proposed initiatives silenced any who might have questioned my qualifications. Professionally, the transition was surprisingly smooth. Personally, it was a revelation. Living with Enzo meant learning the private man beneath the public persona, discovering that he was an early riser who spent the first hour of each day in a home gym, that he had a weakness for vintage Scotch and old Italian films, that he slept with one arm always draped possessively across me, as though afraid I might disappear in the night. It also meant confronting the reality of his world in ways I'd been shielded from as merely his secretary. The late-night phone calls he took in his study, emerging with expressions of cold fury. The meetings with men whose names I recognized from news reports about organized crime. The nights he came to bed late, his hands trembling slightly in a way that suggested violence recently committed. I learned not to ask about these things directly. Instead, I was simply there, waiting up with whiskey when he needed it, providing silent comfort when words would have been inadequate, offering a refuge from the darkness of his business dealings. It was during one such night, 3 weeks after I'd moved in, that everything shifted again. Enzo had been gone all day on business that had left him tense and remote. He'd come to bed well after midnight, pulling me into his arms with a desperation that spoke of whatever he'd witnessed or done. We'd made love with an intensity that felt almost desperate, as though he was trying to anchor himself through physical connection. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in the darkness, I felt his hand drift to rest on my stomach, a casual touch that suddenly felt weighted with meaning. "Elena," he said quietly, "we haven't been careful." My breath caught as I processed his meaning. 3 weeks of sharing his bed, of mornings that often began with passion before we'd even fully woken, of nights when restraint was the furthest thing from either of our minds. In the intensity of everything that had changed, the practical considerations had simply not occurred to me. "I know," I whispered, my hand covering his where it rested against my abdomen. "I haven't. I mean, we should probably. I don't want to be careful." The admission came roughly, as though pulled from him against his will. "The thought of you carrying my child, it should terrify me. It should be the last thing I'd risk, given my world, the dangers. But instead, I prompted when he fell silent. Instead, I find myself hoping." His hand pressed more firmly against my stomach, possessive and protective. "Is that insane? We've been together for less than a month." "Completely insane," I agreed, but my voice was soft, understanding. "But then again, everything about us has been insane from the beginning. Why should this be any different?" He shifted to look down at me, and even in the darkness I could see the vulnerability in his expression, a rare glimpse of the man beneath the armor. "If you were pregnant, would that frighten you?" I considered the question honestly. A month ago, the idea would have terrified me. But now, knowing Enzo's fierce protectiveness, the resources at his disposal, the way he looked at me like I was precious beyond measure. "A little," I admitted, "but not enough to not want it, if it happened." Something fierce and possessive flashed in his eyes. "Then let it happen. Let me give you this, Elena. Let me give us a family." The proposal, if it could be called that, should have sent me running. Instead, I found myself nodding, my hand tightening over his. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." What followed was a claiming more profound than any that had come before. Enzo making love to me with a reverence and purpose that left me trembling. And when we finally fell asleep, his hand still resting protectively over my womb, I felt the last of my reservations dissolve. This was my life now, loving a dangerous man, living in his fortress, potentially carrying his child. It was nothing like the safe, predictable existence I'd once imagined for myself. It was so much better. The positive pregnancy test appeared exactly 6 weeks after our conversation about starting a family. I stared at the 2 pink lines in the bathroom of Enzo's, our master suite, my hands trembling as reality crystallized around me. I was carrying Enzo Moretti's child. The man himself was in his study conducting business, unaware that our lives were about to shift again. I should have been terrified. We'd only been together for 2.5 months, barely knew each other outside of professional contexts and passionate nights. But instead, I felt only fierce joy and an overwhelming need to tell him. I found him bent over his desk, reviewing what looked like shipping manifests, his reading glasses perched on his nose, in a way that made him look almost scholarly. He glanced up as I entered, and whatever he saw in my expression made him immediately set aside his work. "What's wrong?" He was around the desk in seconds, his hands on my shoulders, searching my face with concern. "Nothing's wrong." I couldn't suppress the smile that broke across my face. "Everything's right, actually. I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between us for a heartbeat. Then Enzo's face transformed. Shock giving way to wonder, then fierce, possessive joy that made my heart race. His hands moved from my shoulders to frame my face, his thumbs brushing away tears I hadn't realized were falling. "You're certain?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Elena." My name was a prayer, a promise, a claim. He pulled me into his arms with such careful reverence, as though I'd become something infinitely fragile. My Elena, carrying my child. We stood there for a long moment, simply holding each other, letting the magnitude settle over us. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "We're getting married," he announced, brooking no argument. "As soon as it can be arranged. I want you legally bound to me before your showing. I want our child born with my name, no questions about legitimacy." "Is that a proposal or a command?" I asked. But I was smiling, unable to take offense at his high-handedness when it stemmed from such obvious devotion. "Both." He kissed me thoroughly, his hands already moving to rest protectively over my still flat stomach. "Say yes, Elena. Make this real." "It already is real," I countered. "But yes, of course yes." What followed was a whirlwind. Enzo, once he'd made a decision, proved impossible to slow down. Within a week, he'd arranged for a private ceremony at the estate, intimate and secure, attended only by his most trusted associates, and Maria, whose delight at the news had been unmistakable. The wedding itself was simple but beautiful. Me in an ivory dress that accommodated my barely there bump, Enzo in a dark suit that emphasized his powerful frame, Marco serving as best man with an expression that suggested he'd known this was inevitable from the beginning. When Enzo slipped the ring onto my finger, a stunning diamond that probably cost more than most people's houses, and promised to love and protect me and our child for the rest of his life, I believed him completely. This man, who controlled a criminal empire through fear and calculated violence, who had enemies that required fortress-level security, looked at me like I was his salvation. "I love you," I whispered, as he kissed me to seal our vows, not caring that we had witnesses. "So much. I love you," he returned, his hand finding my stomach in that now habitual protective gesture. "Both of you. Always." The months that followed brought their own challenges. The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite my initial fears, Enzo's protectiveness reaching almost comical levels as my bump grew more prominent. He hired the best obstetrician in the city, insisted on accompanying me to every appointment, and went nearly feral when anyone, including medical professionals, got too close. "You can't threaten my doctor for examining me," I'd had to explain after he'd glared at the poor man for pressing too firmly on my abdomen during a checkup. "It's literally his job." He was hurting you. He was checking the baby's position. There's a difference. But beneath the overprotectiveness was genuine devotion. Enzo attended every ultrasound, his hand gripping mine as we watched our daughter's image on the screen. He researched pregnancy obsessively, ensuring I had every comfort, every resource. When I craved ridiculous food combinations at 3 a.m, he personally went to the kitchen to prepare them, rather than waking the staff. The foundation work continued to fulfill me in ways I hadn't expected. Under my direction, we'd expanded several key programs, established new scholarship funds, and increased community outreach. It gave me purpose beyond being Enzo's wife, a sense of identity that mattered as my belly grew and my world contracted to the estate's secure boundaries. 7 months into the pregnancy, everything changed again. I was in the foundation office, a suite of rooms Enzo had set up in the east wing of the estate, when Marco appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Mrs. Moretti, we have a situation. The boss wants you in the safe room immediately." My blood ran cold. We'd practiced this scenario, an attack on the estate, a breach of security, but I'd never actually believed it would happen. What kind of situation? The Calabresi family has made a move. They're not on the property yet, but we have credible intel they're planning an assault within the hour. He was already moving toward me, his hand on his weapon. "Your safety is the boss's primary concern. We need to move now." The safe room was exactly what it sounded like. A reinforced chamber deep in the estate's basement, stocked with supplies and communications equipment. Marco escorted me there with military efficiency, 3 other security personnel forming a protective barrier around my heavily pregnant form. Enzo was already there when we arrived, pacing like a caged predator, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued rapid commands in Italian. The moment he saw me, he ended the call and pulled me into his arms with desperate intensity. "Are you all right? The baby?" "We're fine," I assured him, though my heart was racing. Marco said the Calabresi family is about to learn what happens when they threaten what's mine. His voice was cold, deadly, the tone I'd heard him use with enemies but never directed at me. "They think they can leverage my family, use you and our daughter as pressure points. They're wrong. Enzo, stay here." He kissed me hard, possessive. "Marco and his team will protect you. I'm going to end this." Fear clutched at my heart. "Don't go. Let your men handle it. You don't need to." "They came after my wife. My pregnant wife." His hands moved to cradle my face, his eyes burning with barely controlled fury. "There is no delegating this, Elena. This is personal." I understood then what I'd always known intellectually, but was now confronting viscerally. Enzo's world was one where violence was currency, where perceived weakness invited attack, where protecting family meant eliminating threats permanently. "Come back to me," I whispered, my hands clutching his shirt. "Come back to us. Always." He kissed me once more, lingering, then turned to Marco. "No one gets past you. You understand? With my life, boss." And then Enzo was gone, leaving me in the safe room with Marco and 2 other guards, listening to muffled sounds from above that might have been gunfire or might have been my imagination. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. Marco maintained professional calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his weapon. I sat in a corner, my hands protectively over my stomach, whispering reassurances to the baby who kicked restlessly, as though sensing my distress. When the door finally opened again, I nearly sobbed with relief. Enzo stood there, his shirt blood-stained, a cut along his jaw, but alive and whole. His eyes found mine immediately, softening from cold fury to fierce devotion in an instant. "It's over," he said simply. "The Calabresi family won't trouble us again." I didn't ask what over meant, what he'd done to ensure our safety. I simply launched myself into his arms as well as my pregnant belly allowed, tears streaming down my face as he held me with careful strength. I was so scared. Shh. He stroked my hair, his voice gentle despite the evidence of violence on his clothes. I promised I'd come back. I always keep my promises to you. That night, after he'd showered and the estate's security had been reinforced, we lay in bed together, my back against his chest, his hand splayed protectively over our daughter's movements. I can't do this, I whispered into the darkness. I can't spend our life terrified that someone will take you from us, that our daughter will grow up without her father because someone decided to challenge your territory. Then I'll make sure they don't. His voice was absolute, unyielding. What happened today? It was a message, Elena. A demonstration of what awaits anyone who threatens my family. The Calabrese family's leadership is gone. Others will think very carefully before making the same mistake. The casual way he referenced eliminating an entire family's leadership should have horrified me. Instead, I felt only relief that the threat was neutralized, that we were safe. What have you turned me into? I asked, only half joking. 2 years ago, I would have been appalled by all of this. Now I'm just grateful you're ruthless enough to protect us. You've always had steel in you, he replied, his lips brushing my temple. I just gave you permission to acknowledge it, to stop pretending you're soft when you're anything but. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps loving a man like Enzo Moretti had simply revealed aspects of myself I'd been suppressing. The willingness to embrace moral complexity, to prioritize family over abstract principles, to find strength in fierce devotion rather than conventional virtue. Our daughter was born 6 weeks later, arriving 3 weeks early, but perfectly healthy. Enzo was there for every moment, holding my hand through labor, cutting the umbilical cord with trembling hands, cradling his daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. We named her Sophia, after his mother, and watching him with her, this dangerous man reduced to awed whispers by a 7-pound baby, I knew we'd made the right choice. The christening occurred 2 months later, an intimate gathering at the estate. Marco served as godfather, his usual stoicism cracking into genuine emotion as he held Sophia during the ceremony. Maria presided over the celebration with the pride of someone who'd watched Enzo grow from boy to man, and was now witnessing the next generation. As I stood beside my husband, our daughter in my arms, surrounded by the unusual family we'd assembled, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From that moment on the terrace in Monaco, through months of hidden feelings and professional distance, to the night everything changed. Happy? Enzo murmured, his arm around my waist, his free hand gently touching Sophia's cheek. Deliriously, I admitted, leaning into his strength. Though if you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd end up married to my boss, living in a fortress, and madly in love despite everything, you wouldn't have believed it, he finished. Neither would I. But Elena... He turned me to face him, his gray eyes holding mine with that intensity I'd never quite grown accustomed to. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and Sophia, my family, my world. I kissed him, soft and lingering, our daughter cradled safe between us. This life wasn't what I'd planned. It was complicated and dangerous, built on foundations that would horrify conventional society. But it was ours, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Years later, when Sophia was old enough to ask how Mommy and Daddy met, I'd tell her a carefully edited version, leaving out the Monaco incident, the dangerous possessiveness, the criminal empire. I'd simply say that sometimes love finds you in unexpected places, with unexpected people, and the only thing that matters is having the courage to reach for it when it does. And when she was much older, maybe I'd tell her the whole truth. That sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't falling for the wrong man, but denying what you feel. because it doesn't fit the story you thought you were supposed to live. I'd chosen the dangerous man, the complicated love, the life that required fortresses and bodyguards and moral compromises. And I'd never been happier. From a moment of unexpected confrontation on a sun-drenched terrace to a love that defied every boundary, Elena and Enzo's journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful connections emerge when we're brave enough to acknowledge what we truly feel. Their story proves that real love isn't about perfection. It's about finding someone worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth building a future with, despite all the complications. If their fierce devotion and hard-won happiness touched your heart, please click like to let us know. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything changed because you finally stopped hiding your true feelings? Share your story in the comments below.